Since the Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, I've seen this article getting passed around on social media by friends, family, and acquaintances whose views of the subject veer more to the left. The article is titled, "I Invented Gilead, the Supreme Court is Making It Real." Now, I haven't looked into the validity of this article's source, but those sharing it claim that it was originally written for The Atlantic by the author of The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood, and it expresses her views of this landmark decision. This is the Margaret Atwood who served as a symbol of women's rights during the Trump administration, when feminists and women's rights activists would adorn themselves in her iconic red cloaks and bonnets during their peaceful protests against what they viewed as the alt-right's attack on womanhood. And it's also the same Margaret Atwood who found herself under fire and labeled as a TERF from the same activists when she expressed on Twitter that women exist absolutely rather than merely subjectively. Now it appears she's been forgiven by the left, and she is under good graces again, and that's an achievement that in itself I find most impressive. So anyway, every time I found this article, I would take the time to read it, I contemplated it, and I contemplated what she had to say, asking myself if her warnings had any merit. Were my rights as a womanhood really compromised on the 24th? Did we step onto a slippery slope that leads down to a dystopian male-dominated totalitarianism? Was I the eyewitness to the beginning of the end of the women's rights that I've taken for granted my whole life and will now be refused to my daughter and her daughter and so on? Is this the first stepping stone that leads down a dark path whose destination is complete reproductive control? Having taken the time to reflect and consider these allegations, or taken time to consider these alleged words of this esteemed author, I've drawn my own conclusion, but I welcome counter-arguments or differing point of views from my leftist neighbors. I'm not a politician, and I'm not an expert on religion, and I do not pretend to be especially endowed with wisdom. So the article reads as follows. In the early years of the 1980s, I was fooling around with a novel that explored a future in which the United States had become disunited. Part of it had turned into a theocratic dictatorship based on the 17th century New England Puritan religious tenets and jurisprudence. I set this novel in and around Harvard University, an institution that in the 1980s was renowned for its liberalism, but that had begun 3 centuries earlier, chiefly as a training college for Puritan clergy. In the fictional theocracy of Gilead, women had very few rights, as in 17th century New England. The Bible was cherry-picked, with cherries being interpreted literally, based on the reproductive arrangements of Genesis, specifically those of the family of Jacob. The wives of high-ranking patriarchs could have female slaves or handmaids, and those wives could tell their husbands to have children by the handmaids, and then claim the children as theirs. Although I eventually completed this novel and called it The Handmaid's Tale, I stopped writing it several times because I considered it too far-fetched. Silly me. Theocratic dictatorships do not lie only in the distant past. There are a number of them on the planet today. What is to prevent the United States from becoming one of them? Now, my first thoughts are, she's right. There are dangers to allowing religion to have high political influence. Religion is a powerful force to be reckoned with, and throughout history it has caused people to do vile and evil acts that go far further than the Crusades. However, a common variable of all countries that has experienced breakthroughs in women's rights and female empowerment is an acceptance of the supremacy of religions that are based on Judeo-Christianity. Historically, the majorly influential religions have been the sister religions of Judaism and Christianity, Islam, and the Asian religions of Hinduism and Buddhism. Of all these religions, it's only Judeo-Christianity that holds men and women to the same moral standards, grants both sexes the same rights, and promises women equal reward in the next life as their husbands. Two of many examples of this being Paul's highly progressive statement in Galatians when he wrote, There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. You are all one in Christ. And Moses, when he wrote, in the image of God he created them, male and female he created them, stating that not just men, but women too, were bearers of the image of God. Now, contrasting this with Buddha, stating that women cannot achieve nirvana, the Hindus executing widows on the grounds that their bad karma had caused their husband's death, or Muhammad stating that women are a majority in hell due to their lack of intellect, one would be foolish to just assume Judeo-Christianity would be the culprit if a male-dominated totalitarianism were to arise due to religious influence. You may argue that such a dictatorship has arose under Catholicism, and my response is this. What a pre-established monarchy allowed to be taught from a religious text banned from being printed or distributed in the common tongue is not a clear example of what free-born and educated people of a democracy would allow their government to enforce. Atwood acknowledges that theocratic dictatorship exists today, and frankly, I find it disturbing that she and all the other feminists that I encounter are so uninterested in efforts to dismantle such atrocities, while simultaneously passionately attacking pro-life views and Christian doctrine in the name of female empowerment. Perhaps this is because fighting for the empowerment of the wives and the daughters of men who our government has just armed with $7.12 billion worth of military equipment would involve real risk, danger, and sacrifice, whereas blowing raspberries at the Duggards can be done from the safety of the internet. I'm not saying I support the Duggards, but what I am saying is there are far bigger fish that the feminists could be frying, if they had the balls for it. Continuing on, the Constitution has nothing to say about women's reproductive health, but the original document does not mention women at all. Women were deliberately excluded from the franchise. Although one of the slogans of the Revolutionary War of 1776 was "No taxation without representation," and government by consent of the governed was also held to be a good thing, women were not represented or governed by their own consent, only by proxy through their fathers or husbands. Women can neither consent nor withhold consent because they could not vote. That remained the case until 1920, when the 19th Amendment was ratified, an amendment that many strongly opposed as being against the original Constitution, as it was. Women were non-persons in U.S. law for a lot longer than they have been persons. If we start overthrowing settled law using Justice Samuel Alito's justification, why not repeal votes for women? Okay, what Atwood fails to inform our readers here is who the majority of those in opposition of the ratification of the 19th Amendment actually were, and that's women. You see, with great power comes great responsibility, and many women of that generation feared being granted the rights of men would also result in them receiving their responsibilities. One example of this would be getting drafted into the next war, be expected to die for their country, having to take responsibility when the person they vote in causes record gas prices, other such things. However, so far, these fears have proven completely unfounded. The idea that this ratification took place because a nation of oppressed women stood up against their male officials until they begrudgingly gave them their right to vote is romanticized and a farce. In fact, it's been argued that outraged feminists actually played a bigger role in the Prohibition era than they did over the Supreme Court's decision concerning the 19th Amendment. So anyway, continuing on. Reproductive rights have been a focus of the recent fracas, but only one side of the coin has been visible, the right to abstain from giving birth. The other side of that coin is the power of the state to prevent you from producing. The Supreme Court's 1927 Buck v. Bell decision held that the state may sterilize people without their consent. Although the decision was nullified by subsequent cases, and state laws that permitted large-scale sterilization have been repealed. Buck versus Bell is still on the books. This kind of eugenics thinking was once regarded as progressive, and some 70,000 sterilizations of both male and females, but mostly females, took place in the United States. Thus, a deeply rooted tradition is that women's reproductive organs do not belong to women who possess them. They belong only to the state. Okay. The problem with bringing up eugenics in this particular argument is that practice doesn't stem from religion. It stems from evolution. It originates from the father of atheism himself, Charles Darwin, when he compared allowing people with undesirable characteristics, as he put it, to reproduce to a farmer breeding bad livestock. In fact, the practice of abortion has been used to push forth eugenics in the United States. They do this by providing abortions in non-white communities and providing them for women carrying babies with diagnoses such as Down syndrome and spina bifida. Margaret Sanger, the esteemed feminist leader and founder of Planned Parenthood, stated quite openly that she aspired to use her clinics to, as she put it, reduce the Negro population along with other human weeds. If this seems far-fetched to you, just go to the library and pick up her biography. She makes her views on eugenics and race exceedingly clear. So, to state concerns that dismantling a machine created by eugenists to push forth eugenics will in fact result in an uprising of eugenics is in fact quite ridiculous, and it shows either complete ignorance or stupidity. Abortion has never been used to prevent eugenics. It has only been used to push it forward. Okay, so. Wait, you say. It's not about the organs, it's about the babies, which raises some questions. Is an acorn an oak tree? Is a hen's egg a chicken? When does a fertilized human egg become a full person or human being? Our traditions, let's say those of ancient Greeks, the Romans, the early Christians, have vacillated on the subject. At conception, at heartbeat, at quickening. The hard line of today's anti-abortion activists is at conception, which is now supposed to be the moment in which a cluster of cells becomes ensouled. But any such judgment depends on religious belief, namely, the belief in souls. Not everyone shares such a belief, but all, it appears, now risk being subjected to laws formulated by those who do. That which is a sin within a certain set of religious beliefs is to be made a crime for all. Now, what Atwood is expressing here is completely half-assed, for lack of a better words. First, she asks foundational questions, but she makes absolutely no effort to answer them or to give an opinion. And then she makes the accusation that every single person who is pro-life or even pro-abortion restriction bases these views on personal convictions concerning souls and sin. This argument is weak and unfounded. Not just because there are plenty of secularists who are also pro-life, but mostly because the subject of a soul is basically never brought up in a pro-life argument. Like, I cannot think of a single time when, during an abortion debate, for or against it, the word soul came up. We are pro-life. We are not pro-soul. Our argument is human lives deserve protection, and literally every accepted biology textbook on the planet states to be scientifically accepted as alive, the matter in question must be comprised of one or more cells, respond to stimuli, grow and develop, utilize and store energy, stabilize its inner conditions via homeostasis, and reproduce. Examples of all 6 characteristics can be found in a fetus at every stage of development, including conception. It's completely unreasonable to preach Trust the science, trust the science, trust the science, in regard to an experimental cure that is void of any standard scientific research, while accusing us of religious zealotry for accepting the official scientific definition of the term alive. Alright, let's get back to Atwood and see what she has to say from there. Let's look at the First Amendment. It reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peacefully to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. The writers of the Constitution, being well aware of the murderous religious wars that had torn Europe apart ever since the rise of Protestantism, wished to avoid that particular death trap. There was to be no state religion, nor was anyone to be prevented by the state from practicing his or her chosen religion. It ought to be simple. If you believe in ensoulment at conception, you should not get an abortion, because to do so would be a sin within your religion. If you do not so believe, you should not, under the Constitution, be bound by the religious beliefs of others. But should the alito opinion become the newly settled law, the United States looks to be well on the way to establishing a state religion. Massachusetts had a state religion in the 17th century. In adherence to it, the Puritans hanged Quakers. The alito opinion purports to be based on American Constitution, but it relies on English jurisprudence from the 17th century, a time when a belief in witchcraft caused the death of many innocent people. The Salem witchcraft trials were trials. They had judges and juries, but they accepted spectral evidence, in the belief that a witch could send her double or specter out into the world to do mischief. Thus, if you were sound asleep in bed with many witnesses, but someone reported you supposedly doing sinister things to a cow several miles away, you were guilty of witchcraft. You had no way of proving otherwise. Similarly, it will be very difficult to disprove a false accusation of abortion. The mere fact of a miscarriage, or a claim by a begrudged former partner, will easily brand you a murderer. Revengeance by charges will proliferate, as did arraignments for witchcraft in 500 years ago. If Justice Alito wants you to be governed by laws of the 17th century, you should take a close look at that century. Is that where you want to live? Now, I find it ironic here that she uses the unjustified killing of Quakers and alleged witches to make her argument for abortion. Because the sole reason we're supposed to be offended by the ideas of Puritans hanging Quakers or of the Salem witch trials is because the unjustified killing of another human being is unjustified. And that also happens to be the bread, the meat, the backbone, the bedrock, the point of the pro-life movement. That killing somebody who is innocent is wrong. And that brings me to saying that this example that stating our religious convictions cannot be used under any circumstance to influence our laws is in itself a regressive idea. For even though we're constitutionally banned from standardizing any religious practices and enforcing those practices on our people, like it or not, we're also a nation founded by highly religious and religiously influenced men. Where does peeling back this influence end? Should we reject do not murder because it is the 5th commandment? Or do not steal because that's the 7th? Do we remove employee laws that ensure workers get days off and vacation time due to its Sabbath day influences? Or do we dispose of our bankruptcy laws that were influenced by the Levitical Jubilee in favor of Old England's debtor prisons and workhouses? What about the Declaration of Independence itself, which was so theistically worded? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If anything were to reset the clock and turn us back to being governed by laws of the 17th century, it would be purging foundational Christian principles, not embracing them. For it was these words of absolute theistic beliefs that led us to refuse dictatorship, convicted us that we were not justified in trafficking our neighbors, and protect us today from institutionalized religion. Bestowing upon the unborn the inheritance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness does not steal rights from women, but it does make sure that people of all sexes, races, religions, and abilities are protected at all times during their life. At no point has any pro-life activist suggested that laws be established to penalize mothers after an alleged abortion, but only the doctors who voluntarily violated their Hippocratic oath by performing these services. Almost unanimously, the mothers of the aborted are seen as victims, and they are met with compassion. In fact, most of the most influential pro-life leaders and activists are themselves post-abortive mothers who experienced regret and change of heart. One of these notable women is Alveda King, the niece of renowned Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Reflecting on her own experiences as both an abortion survivor and a grieving mother of her own aborted children, she stated simply yet profoundly, "Women need love, babies need life." As a pro-life American woman, I stand by Mrs. King's words, and neither Atwood's cries that the sky is falling, nor her dystopian fiction has changed these views. To Atwood, I would say, stop it. Stop trying to create division between the sexes. Stop trying to induce fear in me of my father, my brothers, my husband, and my sons. You do not know them, and you do not know me. But if you did know me, you would understand that I am a much harder animal to cage than you are giving me credit for.